I just hit start on the record.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Let's see here. Let me get myself reacclimated. All right. Happy Tuesday, everybody. And welcome to today's webinar. The topic today is Nonprofit Personnel Management 101 with Edgar Jatu. So looking forward to engaging with all of you, and hopefully the content is something you guys are able to leverage and utilize moving forward. In terms of introduction or agenda for today, just going to go a brief introduction, welcome and introductions. I'm going to give you some insights here that we've kind of gathered that I think are appropriate for today's session. And then I'll turn it over to Edgar to kind of give us his presentation, and then we'll come back for some Q&A. Just a little background on myself. I am the president and CEO of Gryphon Consulting. We're an IT services firm based here in Largo, Maryland, in the DMV. And we focus on supporting and providing IT support services to nonprofits. My second 40 hours, I'm a board member and co-founder of the Black Channel Partner Alliance, which is a nonprofit we started back in 2002 to kind of help Black-owned tech companies accelerate their growth, specifically those in the Microsoft ecosystem. With me today also is Luis. Luis is my Chief Slash Officer. He's got over 20 years of experience here, and he oversees all of our nonprofit work that we perform here at Gryphon Consulting. Just a couple of insights that I thought was interesting that I pulled together for today's session in terms of some of the challenges that nonprofits are facing. Obviously, one that we found here is that 33% of nonprofits today are reporting having job vacancies of 20% or more. So that is huge. And one of the things that I recognize about nonprofits that's different from other organizations is that when you're missing staff and when nonprofits are missing resources, that can have a significant impact, right? Because that means that vital services and support that are needed in a community just aren't being delivered. So just a huge impact to nonprofits in terms of not having, being properly staffed, if you will. The other thing that we're finding is that 80% of small nonprofits have really transitioned to working remotely, during or due to the pandemic. And that's been kind of a blessing too, in terms of being able to work remotely. So what we're seeing with some of our clients, how they're taking advantage of that, is some of them are not renewing leases. They're going into or redoing their leases, not expanding, if you will. If they had expansion plans, are kind of pulling back on that because they can implement a very effective remote work environment. And obviously the cloud, this last stat here, what we're finding is that nonprofits are also finding that cloud-based technologies are definitely enabling them to basically deploy a remote work environment. So there's actually one project currently on my desk right now where we're working with actually two nonprofits. One has about 44 employees. They're looking to actually leverage SharePoint to create a centralized repository. Another nonprofit that we're working with, they fully embrace the cloud. So they're going and leveraging voice over IP as their phone system so that even remote employees, looks like an internal call when they're transferring, they can get a phone call anywhere. We're also deploying some of the security capabilities because they're dealing with personally identifiable information. So we're making sure that that data stays secure. And we're also implementing a virtual desktop environment, which provides even greater security. So they don't have to worry about, what kind of security parameters or systems do they have, let's say in their remote office or in their home. So again, these are ways that technology is really making a difference in helping nonprofits, deliver on their mission. Real quick, just a free offer, some offers that we have for those in attendance today. We're offering a free technical assessment and license review. We actually did a license review for one of our clients based on the West Coast, and save them a significant amount of money. They're a larger nonprofit, but what tends to happen is if you haven't had a review, it's kind of like your cell phone plan, if you will. It's something you should probably review either on a yearly basis or, max every 2 years. If you don't do that, chances are you might be missing out on, promotional pricing, if you will. And that's the case here with some of the donation programs that Microsoft has implemented, which they've restructured. They now have a whole new set of offerings that nonprofits are available to take advantage of. So that's a free assessment. And for those of you that are serving, let's say the Black community specifically, Microsoft has created a separate grant program called the Microsoft Nonprofit Technology grant program. We can help you apply for that grant to get access to a host of resources, everything from email, their Microsoft 365 platform, Dynamics, which is their CRM, and also Azure credits, which you can use to support a virtual desktop environment. And then last but not least, we are providing 10 free licenses of our training platform. This integrates nicely with Teams. So for your team and your employees, the ability to get basically really short video clips of how to perform or use any of the Microsoft suite of tools. So for example, if you want to know how to use a pivot table, you can watch a 3 to 5 minute video clip and you're off and running. All right. So now for the main attraction, I'd like to briefly introduce Edgar. Edgar, who's originally from Cameroon and was raised in New York City. Edgar is passionate about creating workspaces that value fair treatment, trust, and open communications. Edgar is the founding principal of Aficom. Aficom helps organizations embed policies, procedures, and systems that achieve compliance with the numerous laws and regulations governing the employment relationship. Now, I know, Edgar, I probably butchered the company name, so you'll get it straight for me. So without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Edgar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank, for the warm introduction, and for having me here today to do this presentation. It's good to see you all virtually, and I hope that you'll get something out of what I'll be presenting today. So I'm going to share my screen so I can share my PowerPoint. Just bear with me for 1 second. Is that it? There we are. All right. So today we'll be talking about nonprofit personnel management 101. And what does that mean? So essentially what I'm going to go through today is to break down sort of the standard staff members you will see, particularly a nonprofit, because it does operate a little differently than a for-profit corporation, and also talk through some of the best practices in terms of how do you properly classify people that work for your organization at your nonprofit, and some of the common pitfalls that you might encounter at a nonprofit when it comes to properly classifying staff and accounting for their time. And then at the end, I'll do my best to answer any questions you have about anything I presented on today, and then any other topics or any other questions you have related to this topic. So a little bit about me. So Efficium LLC is an HR and management consulting firm, and we help solve business problems through an HR lens. And what we aim to do is to create policy and procedures for our clients that speak to their culture, the type of leadership that they're looking to bring to their organization, but more importantly, to ensure that workplaces are free of toxicity, that they're places where employees and managers can thrive and do their best work, and that they're free of drama. And we provide HR support to many types of organizations, particularly nonprofits, in the DC area and beyond. And some of the work that we do for our clients are, creating handbooks, helping them map out policy and procedures and implementing them, helping with client relations, and just overall HR strategy. And this is some more background about me. I am a I do have a law degree. I did practice law for about 9 years doing employment law, and also I serve on many different boards in the DC area, and also myself, I'm a part-time executive director of a nonprofit. So my experience in this sector is very broad, and on both at the board level and as a staffer as well. So today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about the building blocks of good staff management from a compliance and best practice and operations level. And typically at a nonprofit, you'll see 3 buckets of staff members at any given time. You have staff, or what we commonly refer to as W-2 employees, contractors, which typically are called 1099s, and then you have volunteers, right? And those are folks that are particularly committed to your organization and will donate their time without any compensation. And so the main thing that I want you all to understand about this universe is that they are, as you might already know, a universe of laws and regulations that you have to follow, both at the federal level and at the local level, to ensure that you're properly classifying someone. And what I typically tell any client is that the default should always be, staff, right? For the most part, you should always be aiming to treat people as staff because they get the most protections under the law, and also the law looks more favorably on you having staff members from a compliance perspective. Doesn't mean that you can't have contractors and volunteers. You certainly can do that, but you should always think through, okay, well, is this person someone that should be a staff member? And then you go from there. And then we'll talk about how to do that analysis in a couple of slides. But I just want you to understand that these are the buckets of potential staff members you might have at your organization, and the understanding that how you classify someone might have some compliance significance and also can impact your operations. So a staff member, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is someone who is an employee of your organization and is on the payroll, and so they're receiving wages and benefits in exchange for working for you. So typically, when you have a staff member or an employee, they have a W-2. So at the end of the tax year, you have to issue that person a W-2. They're on your payroll, so you're taking out payroll taxes, and that you submit to the government. But more importantly, you have a level of direction and control over their work, right? So, in most cases, a staff member should have a position description that clearly lays out their job duties and what they're doing for your organization. Typically, with a staff member or an employee, you can control when they can come into work and when they can leave. You can do performance reviews. You can critique their work more regularly, and also you have to carefully track their time. So with a staff member, you could have someone that's salaried. So usually that's a person that is maybe in management or does something that is very specialized in their field or for your organization. And so that person might be salaried. And then you have staff members that are hourly employees. So think about your admin staff or someone that is maybe a coordinator position or works part-time even, right? Those folks will be hourly, and you have to track their time, because if they work, typically, particularly in the DC area, if someone works more than 8 hours in a day, they're eligible for overtime. And certainly if they work more than 40 hours in a week, they're eligible for overtime. So you have to make sure you keep track of their hours, because if you don't, it could lead to a compliance situation if you're not properly paying overtime or properly paying their time in general. If you don't have any idea of what hours they worked, that can create a situation for you where you have to basically go back and track their hours and or figure out what hours they've worked, and then you might be overpaying for someone's time because you didn't properly manage it on the front end. So that's basically what a staff member is. And other things you'll when it comes to a staff member is typically you're providing the tools and equipment they need to do their work, right? So typically for a staff member, you are providing the laptop or computer they're using, or the vehicle that they will be driving, and things of that nature. And then next you have independent contractors, or what we might commonly call 1099. And with independent contractors, typically they're people that have specialized skills, right? So for many nonprofits, commonly you might have a contractor doing grant work for you. So maybe they're only working for a period of time to help you research and apply for grants, or they might be doing something such as IT for you. They come in and only handle your IT needs, and they'll do it for a short period of time each week. So that's typically a contractor. So someone that has a specialized skill. You don't really need to direct a lot of their work because they're considered experts in their field or highly qualified. They typically use their own tools. So they'll use their own laptop or their own vehicle, or you don't really provide many tools to them, and you might just give them access to some of your software, but otherwise they're using their own stuff to do the work. And also, more importantly, they typically have autonomy and flexibility when it comes to not only their benefits and when they take time off, but their schedule, right? Typically, a contractor will tell you when they're available to come in and do the work, or you might mutually agree to a start time and end time to their day, or how they work in a week. But the main theme is that the contractor has equal, they're on an equal playing field with your organization when it comes to how they do their work and when they do their work. Now, for contractors, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but I typically recommend that for a contractor that you have a contractor agreement in place. And the reason why you want to have that is because, for starters, it's a good way to clearly define the scope of work for the contractor and what might end the agreement, how much time the person has to give to end an agreement, or vice versa on your end. But more importantly, from a compliance perspective, if there is no agreement in place that clearly states that a person's a contractor, if they decide that they feel that they are being treated as an employee, they can file a lawsuit, right, and go to the federal or state agencies, or in some places they can just go straight to court and make the case that they're an employee. Now, if you don't have a document or a paper trail that clearly states that person's a contractor, the agencies, whether the federal or state level, particularly in DC, will favor the fact that a person's an employee. And so you want to have that piece of paper that clearly lays out that they're a contractor, and lays out some other things about the arrangement that you want to make sure are covered, especially the scope of work, which will define what they do for you. And then, and on top of that, just having that piece of paper doesn't mean that they're a contractor. Commonly people will say, well, we want to hire someone, a contractor, and we'll just give them an agreement. I'll say, well, hold on. No, you can do the agreement, of course, right? That's absolutely a good way to go, but you still need to do the analysis to ensure that someone can safely be a contractor for you. And for starters, what I would typically say is, from a practical perspective, is this a position where you are okay with having less control over someone's time, in terms of when they come to work and what they do for you, right? You might want to consider the fact that for some positions, you want to have a certain level of control over the person's work and when they come in and how they interface with the public, right? Most nonprofits public-facing entities, right? You have constituents, you have a board, you have people you're beholden to to carry your mission, right? And so there might be some position where you'll say, you know what, we can't have them as a contractor because we need to know or have control of what they say to the public, or the things they do for us that people will see or be direct recipient of, right? And so the calculus might be that that person can't be a contractor, they have to be a staff member, right? And that's just from an operational perspective. And then from a compliance perspective, just because, again, you call someone a contractor doesn't mean they are a contractor. You have to do the analysis to ensure that, okay, are they truly qualified in the work they do? Another thing that people look for is, are they free to take on other projects? So, they might do work for us for maybe 5 hours a week, but they're taking on other clients. That's their business model, right? So that's a good way to ensure that someone, that you'll meet the test for someone being called a contractor. Because if they're relying solely on you as their main source of income, and let's say there's an audit or they decide that they think they're an employee, that would be a fact that would heavily favor them to be called a staff member instead of a contractor. So I would encourage you all to not just always assume that just because we call someone a contractor and give them a contract that says they are, means that you are fully protected from any claims. You have to do the homework to ensure that if we call someone a contractor, we can safely say that. And then next you have volunteers, right? And so volunteers, as most of you know, are individuals that perform a donated act of service without expecting or receiving financial compensation, right? So as you see in this picture, volunteers might typically, come to an event where you're, putting together boxes, for for your constituency, to provide a service. They might even fill in an office task, right? They might do things that, they might stuff mailers or help you manage your donor list, right? They do very discrete acts to help carry out your mission. But a key thing for volunteers, though, is that you want to make sure that what they're doing for you is clearly defined. And we'll cover this in a little bit more later in this presentation, but I'll typically say, even if it's someone that is doing something very small for you, it might be good to confirm in writing what they're doing, and more importantly, how many hours of time they're putting in as a volunteer. You never want to have a volunteer, doing full-time hours for you. And so we're talking about 40 hours a week, more or less. Or I would even say 35 hours a week. You never want to see that happening, because again, if they're working that amount of time for you as a volunteer, then you might run into some compliance issues, which we'll talk about momentarily. And so my biggest advice for volunteers is that make sure it's clear that they're volunteer and confirm in writing what they're doing for you. I think it's even good to have specific volunteer positions. So for some organizations might have a whole volunteer program where they clearly outline all the volunteer positions that one could do, the hours requirements and how many hours are we expecting you to do, to work in this position, and what are your duties as a volunteer, right? And when someone comes to say, I'm interested in doing this particular position, it's a good idea to either have some sort of volunteer agreement or just confirm in writing what they're doing, the job duties, or volunteer duties, and how many hours a week or a month or whomever they expect to be satisfying the role. So this slide gives you a good sense as to some of the things that you need to internalize when it comes to properly classifying someone as an employee, contractor, or volunteer. So I think this slide kind of sums up the prior two slides that we talked about. And again, the biggest thing that I would impart upon all of you today that are listening live or listening to this video later is that you want to make sure that you don't make this decision that you make these decisions carefully. Never just assume that just because you call someone a contracted volunteer means that they might not be an employee. And certainly if you want to have someone be a contractor or a volunteer, especially, you want to make sure that you have those details in writing, because that will be your number one way to ensure that there's no miscommunication or someone feeling that they were told one thing, but they're in fact something else. It's just a great way to cover yourself from an operations perspective, but also from a legal compliance perspective. So next, I want to run through a hypothetical. And so a lot of times when I work with nonprofits, there are many scenarios that come up when it comes to staff management. But one thing that tends to come up a lot is the idea of a staff member or a volunteer having the same role within an organization. It comes up a lot, and I do a lot of advice and counseling on this particular topic. So here's a hypothetical that we'll run through. A nonprofit hired one of its long-term volunteers, Shaq, to work part-time. The part-time position consists of job responsibilities that are very similar to the responsibilities of the volunteer position that the person has been doing for the organization for a long time. And so Shaq continues to randomly visit the nonprofit to volunteer in addition to his scheduled paid hours as a part-time employee. And so the question is it okay for a nonprofit to have a staff member volunteer extra time to the organization? And so here are the rules. So extra work means extra pay. So an employee cannot volunteer to do work that is part of their regular employment duties. And so if they're coming in to do something similar, let's say off the clock in quotation marks, that is very similar to their volunteer duties or employment duty or vice versa, you're going to have to make sure that person is paid for their time. You cannot have an employee do something similar as a volunteer, not pay them. You can't do that. That will absolutely get you into trouble with federal and local authorities, or it could lead to a lawsuit in court. And so you want to keep the duties simple, right? So volunteer work should be conducted outside normal work hours and within typical volunteer work time. And so what I would encourage you to do in this hypothetical is that you want to clearly define what the staff member duties are and what the volunteer duties are. And more importantly, the volunteer duties cannot be the same as the staff member duties, right? So for example, you could have a staff member that does part-time admin work for you, and so maybe they cover the your front desk for a number of hours a week as a staff member, or maybe might work in your gift shop, right, as a part-time staff member. But they cannot volunteer for that gift shop, and they cannot volunteer their hours to do your front desk for you. However, they can volunteer to do mailers. Maybe not even mailers, but they can volunteer to give out to be in your soup kitchen, right, on the weekends. Or they could volunteer to help staff your book club for your organization, right? Because it's a completely separate activity from what you're paying them to do as a staff member. And another thing that you want to consider is that volunteer work should not replace a paid employee position and must be part-time. So a lot of times, and this is what it goes back to, don't always just assume. You have to kind of do the analysis. Is that and for this rule, if you're looking at staffing for certain roles, and you're saying to yourself, okay, well, we could hire this front desk person to work a couple of hours a week, but we can also have a volunteer do that. My advice would be that you probably want to just have that admin person be a staff member, because if you have that person volunteer, you're basically saying that or doing what what this rule is saying you shouldn't do, right, is that you should just hire a person as a part-time staff member as opposed to a volunteer, because that volunteer is replacing a possible paid position. So you can have that volunteer instead working, do soup kitchen work or things that might advance your mission, or not be integral to your company's operations or his operations, but you can't, otherwise you'd have them be a staff member. So circling back to the hypothetical, as I stated earlier, in terms of the rules of road here, Shaq's duties must be clearly defined when it comes to his volunteer work and his staff member work, to ensure that you're avoiding any risky legal situations. Also, you want to better track Shaq's hours in terms of what hours he's doing as a staff member and as a volunteer. And so, especially, given that Shaq was so used to just coming by the nonprofit to do volunteer work, probably moving forward in this scenario, Shaq would have to, ahead of time, plan out when he comes to the organization in what capacity, right? So Shaq should have, for example, a schedule of his part-time hours each week. So, okay, Shaq, you're going to show up and these are the hours you're going to work as a part-time staff member for us. And then here are the hours you're going to be a volunteer, and that should be clearly tracked, so that way they don't mix. So you can better keep track of what he's doing, and again, you avoid unnecessary compliance issues and also operations issues, right? Because there might be times where you don't need Shaq to come by as a volunteer, right? And so if he's there, then it might be murky as to what he's doing there at the time at the nonprofit. And so it'd be good to make sure you're tracking that and that it's planned ahead of time. And this slide will cover, best practices, in terms of how to ensure that you are tracking your personnel properly at your nonprofits, to help with your operations and to, again, avoid any legal compliance issues. So I'm a big fan of documentation, and the one thing that, and the first thing I would say, and this is something I've been saying throughout the presentation, is that you want to make sure that for no matter who the staff member is, or what the personnel is, whether they're a staff member, a contractor, or a volunteer, that you have documentation that clearly states what they're doing, what their duties are, and what are the hours requirements. So for staff members, it's a great idea to have job descriptions for the staff members, and depending on the position, maybe even an employment contract that clearly lays out compensation, hours, you incorporate a job description, pay, and just any other things that would be helpful to best manage that relationship. Definitely for contractors, you absolutely want to have a contractor agreement, as I mentioned earlier. It's one of the best ways you can ensure that there won't be any confusion as to whether someone's a contractor or an employee. And in that contractor agreement, you can lay out the scope of work for that contractor, and the scope of work generally covers their duties as a contractor to your organization, and in that you can also cover the hours they're working for you, how often they're working for you, and so on and so forth. And for volunteers, same thing. You want to have a volunteer agreement that lays out the volunteer position, the job duties, how many hours will they be working for you each week or per month, and any other details that would make sense to have in that agreement. Also, you should properly track work hours for all your staff. You can do this through a time tracker that you and the personnel can maintain together. You can have a sign-in sheet, and there are even some software that allows you to track hours for staff members, volunteers, and contractors all in one platform. But it's just a great way to ensure that, one, particularly if you have um, staff members or contractors who also volunteer for your organization, that you're properly making sure that you're keeping track of the hours so they don't mix. And also it's just a good way um, to see if you need to adjust hours for someone, right? If you have a volunteer that's working too many hours, then and you're tracking that, then maybe you scale it back because it's out of the scope of the agreement they signed, or maybe you have to change their role altogether, right? So it's just a good way to ensure that not only again that you're managing your compliance risk, but you're also um, keeping abreast of operational needs for your organization. And then lastly, I think it's also important to create policies and procedures for your staff and volunteers. So typically, for any organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit organization, I'm a big proponent of having an employee manual for your staff, and that clearly defines um, anything related to employment at your organization. So whether, how does someone request paid time off, or time off in general, or, how do you handle relations with the public, or how do you um, do discipline, or do compensation increases. All of those things can be laid out in your employee manual, which I think is a very good way to help. Again, not only with legal compliance or HR compliance, but also for your operations. Um, Sometimes your manual can cover contractors, depending on what it is. I would say that I would heavily disfavor um, doing that for your contracts, because again, you want to keep that separation between someone who's 1099 and W-2, and a good way to make that really murky is to have a manual that covers contractors, because you don't want them to be considered employees, but you can have a document that goes over how contractors should function in your organization. You should probably you can probably term it something different. I wouldn't make it super long, but it could just be a guide in terms of how you and your contractors work together, and what you and kind of laying out um, the guardrails for the relationship between you and your contractors. So you can have something like that, but I'll just be very careful about how you word it, because again, you want to not have any situation where a contractor believes that they're being treated as an employee. And then also, when it comes to volunteers, I'm a big fan of having volunteer manuals, particularly if you have a large operation that have many different types of volunteers. It's a good way of keeping things organized when it comes to volunteer management. And also, you're clearly laying out the things volunteers should know about working with your organization. And again, if you're a small entity, I don't think you need it as much. I think having an agreement would work just fine. But if you're a larger operation where you rely heavily on volunteers, I think it's a good policy to have some sort of volunteer manual of some sort. Um, and typically, if you're dealing with a population that is at high risk, that is what we might call not only high risk, but can be easily where there's a lot of risk involved. Right? So whether it's minors or people who have dealt with trauma in their lives, you want to make sure that you have something that lays out how volunteers should interact with those folks. You might even lay out in that volunteer manual or agreement that, to volunteer for an organization, someone has to go through a background check, right? That's laid out in, the manual or the agreement, so that way, people understand their rights and obligations, and you can effectively control your volunteer staff. So, any questions for me at this time about anything we've covered today? And I will enlarge so I can, if there's anything in the chat. So I think you can either put your questions in the chat, or I think ask them directly of me. All right. If there are no questions, then I think I will stop here. But thank you all for listening to me today. And and if you want to contact me, here's my contact information. You can reach out to me anytime with any questions related to HR. Thank you all.
Yep. And Luis, are you there, Luis? I was wondering if you could bring folks off of mute real quick.
Yes, I'm here. I'm working on that. Yeah.
Yep. And I just wanted to pose a question, I guess, to those that are still here in attendance. Again, just one last opportunity. If you have any questions or feedback for Edgar, and we'll take you off of mute. We want to thank each one of you for attending today. And then one last thing, I'll go ahead and share here on the screen again, just reminding you of our special offer for those of you in attendance. We've got a free technical assessment and license review. Obviously, if you're not taking advantage of the Microsoft technology grants, we'll help you with that. And then we do have a training platform. Just by way of chat, how many of you are using an HRIS system of some sort? Are you currently using some sort of HRIS system to manage, let's say, onboarding and offboarding, or even like a volunteer management system to manage your volunteers? Not us. Yeah. That's one of the other modules that Microsoft is offering in terms of a donation. They have a volunteer management platform to help you track your volunteers. Again, there's just a lot of great things that Microsoft is making available to nonprofits. And so no one's using a volunteer management system. And what about HRIS? Anyone using an HRIS? And Edgar, your experience, what have been some of the popular HRIS systems that nonprofits are using?
Yeah, so I would say that the more popular ones are Gusto, because it's extremely user friendly, and can do many different things for you. I would say another one that's been popular is ADP. That's another one that ADP is known for its payroll, of course, but also have a HRS system that accompanies its payroll platform. And that's also a popular software that I've seen some of my clients use. But also if cost is an issue, a lot of these entities have nonprofit rates, or you might be able to get something. I know that there is a platform, I think it's called Tech Impact, that you can go through to get discounts on certain softwares.
Yeah, TechSoup.
There, thank you. TechSoup. I knew it was tech something. To get discounts on some of these platforms, and also if you're a very small operation, we typically, we don't necessarily have a platform, but we can help you design, an HR information system, using different softwares like Google Workspace, for example, or Microsoft OneDrive or SharePoint. So that way you can maintain your HR files and documentation in one place. Controller has access to it, and just again, all about operational efficiency.
Yep, and even with SharePoint, you can create workflows. So if you've got time off requests, if you will, even employee onboarding, you can automate that process with SharePoint. So lots of capabilities there to kind of help with the onboarding and offboarding of employees too. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Edgar. I really appreciate you being here today. It's been a pleasure. And be on the lookout, everyone, for our next webinar. We'll definitely add everyone here to our email list. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel. So if you want to share it, or if you want to come back and review a segment again, you'll be able to do that. We typically have our content up within 48 hours after the live event. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Edgar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.